Okay, so chapter 15 of Acts. Here we have the Council of Jerusalem. And in the Council of Jerusalem, we've got a couple of things that we're having to figure out, right? We've got both Jews who are very traditional, who have feasts, who have these things that have been established. They have synagogues, all of these things that have been established, these rules of how to live. And I'm not talking about the laws, but just simply the 10 Commandments, right? Of how to live and how to be and what to eat. They've been established for centuries, right? And now we have Gentiles coming into the fold. And we've got a new sort of religion that's going to mix these two things, right? And we've got to figure out how's that going to work? How's that going to work? And so the Barnabas and Paul are sent to Jerusalem because there's a sharp debate. There's a dispute because people are saying, well, they need to be circumcised. If they want to be Christians, then they need to be circumcised. And Paul is like, wait a minute. We can't impose our laws of old onto new Gentile believers, because he says, in verse, where is it? 10. He says, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? It's not just circumcision, but it's also the law and all of the things that come with the law. And he's like, that's not why Jesus came. Remember, Jesus came to fulfill the law. Therefore, because he fulfilled it, we don't have to fulfill it in the same ways. Of course, we have to be obedient to it, but there are certain things that don't come against us in this way anymore, right? We're not under the law in the same way because Jesus fulfilled the law. I know that sounds really complicated, but just keep going with me, okay? At the end, remember the law, there were over 600 laws added to the law that God gave to the people in Exodus and in Leviticus. And so, and these things were very, some of them were very difficult and interesting, because, for example, there was the do not wear mixed clothing. In Syria and in certain parts of the world, they would mix. For example, mixed clothing would be like leggings. Okay, so anything that's both polyester and cotton and nylon, those would be mixed fabrics. For whatever reason, God said, and it wasn't, and the reason, well, it's not for whatever reason. The reason that God gave that law is because he was setting apart his people. And what was happening is that they would wear these certain mixed fabrics during high pagan holidays. And so it was these certain people would wear these kinds of fabrics. And so God said, no, we're not going to do that. You're going to be set apart. You can only wear one thing. So it became extreme always because because it was like, that was you could not have any part of God if you wore mixed fabrics, which is not the truth, right? So it's like, okay, let's look at this as a whole and see what needs to be upheld and what doesn't matter, because remember all of the Gospels, it's about the heart. So Paul and Silas tell them about the signs and wonders and how God has opened the doors to the Gentiles. And James, who is the brother of Jesus, says, listen, even Simon Peter, it says Simon in my Bible, but Simon Peter, he said, tells us how God intervened for the people and for the Gentiles. And so they came to this agreement and they send this letter, okay? And he says in verse 19, this is James talking, and he says, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from these things. And he says it's to abstain from food polluted by idols, sexual immorality, and from meat strangled animals, and from blood. For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times, and it is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. Okay. So what he's saying here is these are the three things that they need to abstain from, and this is all we're going to ask of them. He says they need to abstain from food polluted by idols, all right? So in other words, anything that a lot of times what these people would do, or what they would sacrifice their idols and make sacrifices to the idols and with food. That could not be eaten. We could not partake in that, right? Anything that was obviously sexual immorality. So that's rampant in the Roman world, much like today, actually 100 times worse. So sexual immorality is a no-no. And then finally, the meat of strangled animals and from blood. So basically, they would strangle these animals, and it was demonic practices. Okay, and so that was important as well. Obviously, food and dietary laws have always been a big deal, and but this food in particular was connected to pagan sacrifices. So anything that had to do with pagan sacrifices or idol worship, they made sure that was not an issue, that they did not partake in that. And so then it says, for the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times. Basically what he's saying, if they want more instruction, they can go into the synagogues and they can hear the scriptures being read, and they can learn from the scriptures. Now, what we know is that in the early church, what was really, really important were the 10 Commandments. Those were really, really important. And that was always a thing, right? So they send this letter with Silas and Judas, and they were leaders there in the Church of Jerusalem. And they go and they send it back with Paul and Barnabas. And they're sent to confirm all of these things and all of these words. And again, he says in this letter, you're to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. So you will do well to avoid these things, is what the letter says. So the men are sent off, and Judas and Silas they are there, and they all encourage, and we see that Judas and Silas were prophets, and they spend their time with the believers, encouraging them and all of that stuff. And then we have an interesting little segment here where sometime later it says that Paul and Barnabas were going to go back on their missionary journeys, their second missionary journey. Barnabas wanted to take John, who was also called Mark, and Paul does not, because he said he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. So there was some tension. Something went down. This is it's always an interesting part. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left. Commended by the believers in the grace of the Lord, he went to Syria and Cilicia, strengthened by the churches. Okay. This is what I would call church hurt. This is what I would call church disagreement. This happens all the time. People have different opinions, different reasons, different understandings. For whatever reason, Barnabas was, he felt bad for John Mark, or maybe who knows what would happen. Maybe he sided with him. He didn't side with Paul. And there's a split here. There's a split. The beautiful thing is that God works within these splits. Was one more right than the other? Who knows? That's not what the Bible's talking about, is it? The Bible doesn't talk about who was right and who was wrong. The Bible doesn't talk about, was Paul too hard? Was Barnabas too soft? Was John Mark right? Was John Mark wrong? Should he have gone? Should he not have gone? The Bible doesn't talk about that. What the Bible talks about, the focus here is that they still went. They didn't stop. So they didn't stop building churches. They didn't stop preaching the gospel. They didn't stop working in the giftings. They continued to go, despite the break up, despite the hurt. Of course there were hurt. Of course there were feelings. But the work did not stop. The work continued to a greater effect, because a team of two very strong, very wise, very mature believers went and continued the work in a greater scheme. It was better. It was multiplied. It was multiplied. That is how we deal with church hurt. Church hurt is going to happen. We are people with all kinds of reasons, excuses, and beliefs about things, with all kinds of background and baggage and everything, right? With all kinds of immaturity and uncertainty and insecurity. That is who we are. All of us. We can all be triggered by completely different things. What one person does, what one church does, can totally affect us in a completely different way. And what happens is See, immature believers, what happens is that you stay stuck, either stay stuck in your places and you don't move further, or worse, you retreat back to the world. But here, we continue and we go. And we keep going. Even if split, we keep going. And you will see that they come back together. That's chapter 15 for you.